Hi, my name is Andrea Limbago, and I'm here to discuss some recent research I've been conducting looking at the growing regulatory shifts of government-mandated access to data across the globe. Now, to be clear, I'm not really talking about their cyber offensive behaviors or cyber attacks in that regard, but more so focus on these major regulatory shifts that are happening across the globe. Now, the part of this research started a couple of years ago when I was looking at the encryption debate and the rise, yet again, of the crypto wars, and looking at just all these different governments that are starting to mandate access to data via backdoors and encryption, and looking at the population of those countries and realizing that over half of the world's population lived under governments who were mandating or considering mandating government access to data. And so that was concerning. And then even on top of that, it wasn't really just through the encryption backdoors, which is what we commonly think about. It was through a whole range of different kinds of regulatory shifts that were equally troublesome if you're concerned about data protection and individual data rights. Now here's what we normally see historically. We've seen technology tends to skyrocket at an exponential pace, and that, of course, is happening still. And policy has basically been flatlined. We haven't seen major policy shifts across the globe, especially in the digital realm. But all of that is changing now. The new normal really is looking at policy skyrocketing, not necessarily at the pace of technology for sure, but it is changing dramatically and is an extremely dynamic landscape with enormous implications for data security and data protection. Now, as I mentioned, the backdoors and encryption was a big concern and big impetus for looking at some of this research. And what I found was that really it was part of this broader positioning of governments towards what I'll think of as data hoarding, gathering as much data as possible for greater control of that information. And so the crypto wars were certainly, and still are, a big concern in that area. But there are other kinds of shifts that were going on. We're seeing greater demands for source code disclosure for companies that are operating in a certain country. We're also seeing data residency risk on the rise. And so when you think about data residency, it falls under a couple different names, and there are somewhat nuances that distinguish them. But if you think about data sovereignty, data localization, data residency, really it's this focus on data storage within a country. And that can impose all sorts of different risks depending on which country that's in. We also see the rise of surveillance and tech infrastructure, and in turn with that, with government access to that data, which also can be extremely worrisome given just the enormous amount of data that comes circulating through those technologies. And then finally, there's the broad range of just blatant data access requirements. And all of these generally are under the auspices of national security requirements. And so you'll hear the same kind of discussions made across the globe, whether in authoritarian regimes or democracies, really asking for data access upon request for various kinds of national security reasons. And so looking at this, you see a whole range of different kinds of tactics starting to be pursued by governments. But at the same time, there is this orthogonal or counter trend going on in the realm of data protection. And one of the biggest contributors to that is the General Data Protection Regulation from the European Union. And I know, love or hate it, it really is the most prominent one out there right now that focuses on individual data protection rights. But it's not alone. In Brazil, they passed the LGDP, which similarly has drawn from some inspiration from the GDPR. We have in Africa, almost half the continent has adopted some form of data protection laws, with many other countries also proposing other kinds of data protection laws. In the United States, California's CCPA is the most prominent and really has had far-reaching impact given the size of its economy, and it has led to other states within the United States as well adopting similar kinds of data protection laws. And so given this, we've got these divergent trends going on. We've got greater interference of the government across the globe when it comes to data protection and access risk. And it really just drove home this notion that while we do realize that something like malware and viruses spread very quickly across the globe, when it comes to data protection and cyber risks, borders do exist on the internet. And so I wanted to look at what kind of risks are those? How does the supply chain risk? And the splinternet is really this notion of the division of the global internet by sovereign territories. And so what impact does it have for companies when they're thinking about where they're going to be located across the globe? Data protection and cyber risks definitely vary quite a bit by location. And which of these movements is gaining traction? Are the data hoarders winning, or are the data protection advocates winning? And so what I want to do is really look across the globe, look at a country by country comparison, apples to apples, and figure out where these countries are racking and stacking, and then creating that baseline so we eventually can start doing some trend analysis. And so in order to do that, you have to quantify it. And so that's the goal of the project that I'm focused on right now. And before getting into that research design and some of the data, I think it's really important to first focus on that research design and provide an overview of that shifting regulatory landscape so you can see what these realm of tactics and processes and policies and laws are that governments are starting to pursue. And so for a little bit of context, if we were to look at the data protection and data hoarders sort of as this broad spectrum, really where they tend to have on one end of the spectrum are the digital authoritarians. You may also hear that as techno-dictators. This is where governments, generally authoritarian governments, are those that are trying to gather up as much information as data as possible, gather control of that data, and generally it's been through a lot of offensive behavior, but also through censorship, data manipulation, disinformation. I mean, it's a whole big toolbox. And just the latest tool in this toolbox is government-mandated access to data by a lot of these countries. And it's a trend that's really gaining traction. There's been a lot of research lately over just the rise of digital authoritarians and the diffusion of this kind of ideology across the globe. Now, conversely, on the other end are digital democracies. Now, this is a much more nascent notion. There really is a very solid playbook starting to emerge for digital authoritarians. That same kind of playbook does not really yet exist for digital democracies, but it is starting to emerge. And the foundational components of this really focus more on open, secure, resilient internet. Focus on individual data rights, individual data protections, and no government access to that data, or very minimal, or within some sort of transparent guardrails for that access to information. And again, there's more aspirational at the end of the day, but this is where we're seeing a movement towards that many of the democracies are moving toward. But the reality is it's not just those two ends of the spectrum. It's really much more so a spectrum of policies, tactics, and norms, and we're seeing a whole lot of different countries falling in this middle area, sort of a hybrid, that are adopting some aspects of the authoritarians, some aspects of the democracies, and are really putting it together to meet their own regime objectives and government objectives. And so when looking at that, when you think about the digital authoritarians and digital democracies models, really the countries and entities that are really leading the way in this kind of research and setting the standards for those global norms, the standard bearers, are China and the European Union. And so when thinking about creating this research design and what kind of components to start coding in order to do that apples to apples comparison across the globe, started with these two to look at their laws and regulations to see what should provide that foundation and then build upon that. And so first, when looking at the rule setter, so China. China has a cybersecurity law. That's probably been the most prominent component of it. But there's been many other policies that have been passed within China that are really focused on this notion of cyber sovereignty. And that's really for governments maintaining the right to control the information within their borders without interference from others. And so on the surface, that sounds great. But then when you get into sort of the devil's in the details as far as how the government is going to control information, how that leads to the various kinds of censorship, limitations, infringements on civil liberties, and surveillance, and so forth. And so what comes along with cyber sovereignty also, especially in China, you have additional internet controls, you got state access to data or asking for technical support to access that. But at the same time, there are security standards as well. So various kinds of standards for protecting that data, which is where you do see, again, this countries tend to pick and choose from these two opposing ends of the spectrum in light of what their objectives. And so China for sure wants their corporations to have data protection against the range of attacks they may be facing. And so you do see the different kind of integration across the board. China's latest 5-year plan has a big emphasis on tech self-reliance, and this largely stems from the industrial policy that's shifting the United States that is limiting various kinds of the major tech giants from China from being within the United States supply chains. And we're seeing that pop up across the globe as well. And so China's 5-year plan is taking into account these shifting dynamics on industrial policy to also integrate their own self-reliance, self-sovereignty, data localization, and really greater government influence over the data. And then finally, there's a new data security law that will come into effect in a few months later this year that's seeking to limit the collection of private data, which falls under that notion of data minimalization, which is something that a lot of democracies will propose. And so you see some commonalities there with GDPR. But at the same time, they're also classifying private sector data by its importance to national security and state interests. And so this is where it gets a little muddy again, where you can see that depending on how the government decides to define what their state interests are, they could require access to any of that kind of data. And so that should be something that could be troubling for companies that do have a presence in China. And so you look at that on the one end, and the other end we have the European Union, the GDPR, which I've mentioned. There are several principles that guide the GDPR. These include transparency, data minimalization, like I mentioned, security standards. This is where you get there have been fines so far for companies who have not used encryption, so it's almost counter the anti-encryption movement. there's much more accountability and transparency and strict standards for data transfer outside of the EU. So while there aren't requirements for data localization within the EU, there are various kinds of standards for where the data can flow, and generally to countries that have equal levels of protection of that data. So there are some limitations on data transfers. And just a lot of this discussion from the GDPR just across the EU is really broadening into other areas of technologies, from AI to facial recognition, and banning that in public spaces. And so there's a lot to watch there to see how EU is starting to set the standards in other areas in addition to data protection. Now, those two aren't alone. It's really important to also look at how other governments across the globe are starting to internalize these various kinds of policies that are out there. So Turkey is one that has, was a democracy. We're seeing that slide a bit, and along with that slide, you see increased censorship, increased requests for access to communications data. And an interesting component of Turkey is this notion of forced localization and forced appointment of local representatives. And so what that means is that there needs to be a Turkish citizen or company that also is by an appointment that representative within that local representative. And so that local representative could in turn be much more amenable to turning data over to the government when asked. And so it inherently means less control for companies of their data. In Ecuador, moving across the globe, there's interception of communications permitted. There are some terms requiring service providers to hand over data or technical information, or to decrypt encrypted data. And so there has been this movement towards that. There's something called the all-seeing eye, as far as some greater surveillance going on. But a couple of years ago, following their major data breach of 20 million citizens, that sparked this big movement internally towards greater data protection. And just in May of 21, they passed a data protection law. And so again, we see these different trends really coming head on within different countries. Again, moving across the globe over to Thailand. Thailand has passed a very strict cybersecurity law a few years ago, really enabling government officials to seize and access data on demand. And again, back to this notion of requiring them to be able to decrypt or offer other kind of data encryption or decryption kind of processes. In Kazakhstan, they've done a little bit of exploration on something that basically is a certificate that would have to be put on all devices. And with that, it basically ostensibly means that there's a man-in-the-middle kind of access for the government to any kind of data on those systems. There's been a lot of back and forth on that. It was going to get implemented, and then the population pushed back on that. And so has not been fully pursued there. But the reason why even just exploring it matters is that what we saw just recently in the spring of 2021 is that in Mauritius, a country in Africa that has historically been a very solid democracy, is starting to move towards greater censorship over social media, and along with that, moving not just to censorship, but also moving to an area where the government is considering a law to intercept and decrypt internet traffic through that similar kind of notion of putting a certificate and government control on devices within the country. And within this, there's no judicial oversight. And that's one of those aspects I think becomes readily apparent that needs to be focused on, is how much transparency, how much judicial oversight are there of these laws, because that also has big implications for how these laws are going to be pursued. And finally, looking at Cambodia, they have a new decree that's requiring all external traffic to go through a government-controlled hub. And this, again, as you have all the traffic going through one spot, it makes it easier for the government to control and access it. The only oversight there is by a regulatory body who also oversees their social media. And so you see that going on. And what also is interesting about the Cambodia case is that these laws don't just have implications for companies that may have data there or just accessed by the Cambodian government. What we've also seen is that over the course of the pandemic, Cambodia had a QR code contact tracing app, and with that app, gather clearly a lot of data, a lot of individual data across of all the citizens, and that data has been requested by China in exchange for a telecom upgrade from Huawei. And so you start seeing this tit for tat, and you can imagine, we hear this notion of data being the new oil. Not sure I'd go that far and talk about it quite in that same way, but at the same time, data is becoming very, very valuable, and handing over data can become a bargaining chip in a whole range of other areas across the policy spectrum. Now, to be sure, democracies aren't alone in this, or have not been, separate from these kind of trends that are going on. In Indonesia, one of the biggest Muslim-dominant democracies across the globe, there's some pending legislation that's a little bit worrisome that focuses on censorship, and that's really what a lot of people have been focusing on with it, but it also focuses on providing access to systems and actually could bypass the data privacy laws that are already in place. And so again, we're seeing data privacy laws come head on with some of these data access kind of requirements. In Australia, the anti-encryption law that was passed a couple of years ago, I think, has made a lot of news. And again, the transparency on that has not been as clear as a lot of advocates would like to see. And so that's something to keep an eye on, especially since along with Australia, it moves also into the Five Eyes area, are also considering similar kinds of laws from that alliance. And then in the UK, they historically had something that was called the Snoopers Charter, which was just very recently found to be in violation of rights of privacy by the European Court of Human Rights. And so there's, it has been replaced by a new law, but at the same time, there's still some growing concerns out there as far as the breadth and reach and transparency over various kinds of surveillance and data access. And so by no means are democracies immune from this kind of tendencies. And so looking at that, we have this whole range. We see all these different tactics that are going on. And so basically after doing a lot of that research and seeing what sort of that realm of what exists currently is, it's time to start building the model. And so one of the first steps was really thinking about what kind of questions do I want to ask that I want to be coding on. And so for sure, data residency or data localization, are there those data storage requirements? Joint ventures, are there those forced representatives or forced collaborations with a local representative? That can lead to less control over your data. What were the encryptions and surveillance policies? Are there source code disclosure requirements? What kind of transparency and judicial oversight is there? Is it independent, or is it just is it by an intelligence agency, for instance? And then finally, what kind of data protection and privacy laws are out there? And so with that, so as the broader spectrum of data to gather, the next step was actually gathering a lot of that data, and that really became a data in a haystack problem where you see there's so much information available that's out there, and there's a lot that's in the security and privacy realm, but so much of it is not actually in security and privacy sources. Actually, a lot of this information that I also found was more along the lines of business intelligence and the ease of doing business kind of research. And so it was expanding outside of the research that our community does and pulling in from other areas as well to assess what kind of risk there may be to data access. And to just give a quick overview of what that may look like. For any kind of analysis, it's really important to not just rely on one single source of data. There's so many problems that can go along with that, from data biases to just being outdated. And so this is just one example. I talked about Mauritius earlier. U.S. State Department was a great source for their investment climate. They write a lot as far as the joint venture requirements, various kinds of even source code requirements at times. And so that was very useful, but at the same time, you don't want to rely solely on one source, and certainly not one from a specific government. And so expanding that out, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, also provided an awful lot of information. This is from Freedom House, where they ask questions along the lines of the range of surveillance that's going on. And then also there's the Data Protection Africa found a great regional site that really dove into the various kinds of data protection laws that are there, providing things along the lines of, is there a law? If not, has one been passed? What kind of cross-border data flows are there? What kind of regulations are there? So that was great, but it was very it's regional specific. That doesn't exist for every other region across the globe, unfortunately. And then if you look at it, it was last updated over a year ago. And as I talked about, in just April of this year, the new law was proposed that is raising a lot of concerns among human rights advocates. And so staying on top of it, so not only making sure you have a diverse range of sources, but also looking at the timeliness of it, because this is all moving so fast. But so from there, finding the source is really pull together the range of questions, focus on these core areas to create that spectrum along a spectrum of data protection to more invasive government intervention and creating scores along those lines. And so had a series of questions where they can code. It could be something that's binary, like is there or is there not a joint venture requirement? But very often it actually gets even more into that, because a lot of these joint venture requirements only occur in certain industries. And so that is not as far-reaching as it may be for full global or countrywide various kinds of data joint venture requirements. But really the overall themes, again, were data storage, looking at what the restrictions on access to data are, what kind of data protection laws and oversight exist, and the source code disclosure requirements. And all pulled together that data for 189 countries or territories. And so a lot of different research, a lot of different sources, all though being coded and based upon those same kind of questions. Do these things kind of exist, and to what level? And so from there, basically got a scoring from most invasive to more data protection. And so we'll look at the results briefly. So on the end of government intervention, There aren't a ton of surprises in this area. North Korea, China, Russia are really at the top as far as really intervening and mandating various kinds of data access. And then if you go down the list a bit more, not surprising, but what's important to note is it is really, it's global. This isn't something that's staying in just one region of the globe. And one that may stand out to people that may not, live and breathe the data regulation laws across the globe is Vietnam. Someone who works in supply chains a lot as well. A lot of companies are considering moving out of China, and one of the first options is they think about going to Vietnam. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one thing that it's important to be aware of is that some of the cyber risks may be similar. It's certainly not at the level of sophistication, but the various kinds of policies that the government's enforcing do mirror those of China. And so the cyber risks in Vietnam may be much greater than someone may assume purely by looking at other kinds of factors. And so it's where these kind of policies and laws really become really important to keep an eye on. At the same time, the good news on the data protection, we see a lot of some of the smaller countries really starting to show their strength in data protection and enforcement of individual data protection rights, followed by a lot of the EU countries. But as well, we start seeing, again, that these are global as well. We've got Japan, Uruguay and Latin America, you got some of the Caribbean countries. So both trends are occurring across the globe. And these are just the two ends of the spectrum. And really what was interesting was seeing a lot more falling in the hybrid. You probably wonder where the United States may fall, and that really was at the bottom part of the first third, so barely made it in the top first third. And so, looking at not just the countries and where they fall, I think it's also important to look at what are some of these overarching trends that came from all this. Almost 100 countries have passed data protection laws, and so that's a great move if you're for proponents of data protection. And there actually have been many more that have been passed, just not yet enacted. So definitely something to keep an eye on in that area. And greater accountability is on the rise. We're seeing much more enforcement of these laws. GDPR is still fairly nascent in the long scheme of things, and so we're seeing some accountability, some fines starting to emerge, and it could be a tipping point where you actually start seeing some other kinds of behavior emerge. And it is starting to spread elsewhere as well, as far as growing demand for this kind of data protection. And a lot of that comes not just from corporations who want to protect their data, but it comes from a global societal interest that's growing and demanding greater data protection, like I talked about with the example of Ecuador. And so while those are the good trends, on the negative side, really what I see a lot is this movement from censorship and manipulation to next step being global mandated data access. And so that's a concern, that if the censorship and manipulations isn't working, let's go straight out and try and grab that data through legal shifts and regulatory shifts. What we're also seeing is that while there are all these data protection laws, there also is a gap between the law and the reality. There definitely were some scandals that popped up that I would find in the research that were actually showed that governments were not adhering to their own policies, and so that's troublesome. Definitely see the rise of the rest, where you see more copycat laws starting to spread. The Chinese model is spreading across the globe for a variety of reasons. And a lot of this interference and a lot of these regulatory shifts we actually start seeing around elections. So again, direct implications for democracy. And in the hybrid, really a lot of countries are falling in that hybrid area where they're pursuing some aspects of the authoritarian model and some aspects of the democratic model. And this is a great overview from Financial Times, more so on surveillance technology, but it looks very similar to the government mandated data access, where you see some democracies pulling from the authoritarian model as well. And just a lot of those countries that kind of are teetering on the brink between authoritarianism and democracy, really pursuing a lot of these more surveillance and data access leaning policies. And so for the next steps, that clearly this was sort of the first iteration of this design and the first iteration of this data collection and coding. And so one of the biggest things that became so apparent during all of this is that while I knew the regulatory landscape was shifting fast, it's moving even faster than I could possibly have imagined. It's really moving at a dramatic speed. And it's quite a lot of variation across the globe. I've got everything from the U.S., which I didn't talk a ton about, pushing tech firms to hand over source code, to India, again, one huge democracy, really falling in that hybrid model with some data protection pursuits, while also at the same time demanding data access from various social media companies. You've got the EU, as strong as the GDPR is. You've got the Hungarian government suspending some aspects of it. So just a lot of different changes going on across the globe, and really need to stay on top of that. And so that's really one of the biggest considerations, is how to stay apace this change. And so start versioning this information, put timestamps on it, to enable then that tracking of the temporal shifts to see really how countries are moving and where the balance is tipping in these two different views and frameworks of government-mandated data access. Community input. One of the great reasons of being here at Black Hat is to get community input, so definitely welcome questions either during this time or after to both get additional information. I know there are people out there that are much smarter than I am on all these different countries, so would love to hear what they have to say. And then what other things to consider as far as other kinds of tech risks. There's all sorts of different ways that governments can mandate data access via technologies or other kinds of dependencies. And there will be a white paper coming that really walks through the research design methodology and rankings and provide that for additional feedback as well. And so as I continue working on this research, certainly these changes are coming fast. There's no shortage of news that will require me to update the model. So I will continue tracking the balance, seeing which way it tips, which one of these frameworks starts to emerge. And I do believe our community has a very strong role to play in helping tip that balance. And so I'm excited to be able to present this information, this research here. I look forward to your comments and really look forward to seeing how our community can play a role in increasing data protection across the globe. Thank you.